A nation founded on faith. Now we're divided. We're not as holy as we used to be, but truth still rocks. Light still leads. This is Holy Sorta.
Welcome to the Holy Sorta podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Hayes. This is the podcast where we talk about current affairs through a somewhat sorta biblical worldview. We don't pretend that history was cleaner than it actually was, and we're taking a look at modern day America, and we're going to hear your input on what you think about the state of the division in this nation. You know, America was never purely holy, but it also was not built on moral chaos. And we see a lot of chaos today, I think, if we just look around. You know, America was actually something kind of in between being purely holy and being this total place of chaos. It was holy sorta. And that's what we try to talk about and get to in this podcast. You know, let's be honest, America is just a little bit weird nowadays. And maybe it always has been. We were founded by men and women who believed our human rights come from God. That makes sense to a lot of people. A lot of people don't get that either. But the founders, they didn't want government running religion. I think that's pretty clear. They did value faith, but they were not all saints. And you know, they didn't want government running religion, but they didn't want government without religion or without moral principles. They believed morality was actually essential for liberty. They also argued fiercely with each other about nearly everything. We're still arguing fiercely, and that's a part of democracy. The problem is when we can no longer come to a compromise and we just become further and further divided from each other. You know, the founders were brilliant. They were complicated. They were definitely imperfect. And I think that can describe a lot of folks that we see running our government today. Yet somehow, the founders and all the tension that they experienced and dealt with, they wound up building the most influential constitutional republic in modern history. That is America. And honestly, that's holy sword. I've heard from a lot of folks saying, hey, we're close to civil war. Just look around and see what's going on. We don't want to really get too far deep into using that term civil war because there's a lot of historians and scholars who would say that we're more politically polarized in this era than since the end of the American Civil War. But whether we're close to another civil war, that's a whole other ball game, and it depends heavily on how we define the term civil war. We've got at least a couple of schools of thought here. Some of the academics and experts in the field of political science will argue that the U.S. is in its most dangerous internal condition since the 1860s because of polarization, political violence, distrust of elections, and identity-based politics. These are things you probably hear about each and every day if you watch the news. Other academics and experts are going to argue the country is nowhere near an actual civil war, and let's pray to God that is the case, because the conditions that usually produce civil wars, quote unquote, include organized rebel armies, territorial control, military fragmentation, and state collapse. Now, those elements are absent. We are, however, probably meeting those elements that indicate a very dangerous internal condition: the polarization, political violence, distrust of elections, and identity-based politics. Now, historically, there have been other periods that were arguably as dangerous or even more dangerous than the period we're in right now. Let's just look at the late 60s and early 70s. And we'll take a very brief look at, you know, we had the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers, Robert F. Kennedy, J.F. Kennedy, bombings by extremist groups, violent clashes over race in the Vietnam War. And there were also, this period was also marked those periods were also marked by National Guard deployments on college campuses. And then there's another period before the Civil War leading up to that. Maybe that's a more relevant period to look at if we want to talk about Civil War, which we don't really want to talk about too much. But in the 1850s, there were open armed conflicts, particularly in Kansas. They called it Bleeding Kansas. There was congressional violence. States were openly threatening secession, and eventually they did. And there were also competing militias. So, what makes the current era unusual is that polarization is nationalized and constant through social media. And, they didn't have social media in the 60s or 70s or 1850s, right? And that's made a big impact on the way politics are conducted, the way Americans look at core institutions, and a lot of Americans are distrusting those core institutions simultaneously. As Americans, we used to gather around our core institutions, and when we had a president elected or we had a common cause, we used to at least kind of come together and support each other as Americans. We find a lot of distrust now and a lot of polarized individuals. It's tearing apart families, it's destroying friendships and relationships. It's causing people problems in their workplace, in their houses of worship. Our USA, the United States of America, looks more like a period of chronic democratic instability and sporadic political violence than a classic North South Civil War scenario, or even an East West or something, you know. Um, so we do definitely have this polarization. However, armed conflict seems like a real stretch. Administration scholars are cautious about using the term Civil War for the current United States because the country is not experiencing organized armed factions controlling territory the way it did during the American Civil War. So that's an important point to latch onto and think about. There are several indicators that scholars, however, associate with societies under severe internal strain, or what we might call a cold civil conflict, a cold civil conflict. Three commonly discussed and researched signs are: one, extreme political polarization; two, rising political violence and normalization of extremist rhetoric; and three, information fragmentation and competing realities. Now let's look at one, extreme political polarization. Americans are increasingly seeing supporters of the opposing political party not just as wrong, but as immoral or even dangerous. Surveys from organizations, well-respected ones, are showing things like declining trust in institutions, growing hostility between partisan groups, and a reduced willingness to compromise, rising political violence, and normalization of extremist rhetoric. That's the second component. Events such as January 6th, where we saw the United States Capitol attacked, basically. That demonstrated that some political actors and citizens were willing to use force over disputed political outcomes. That was an historic event. Analysts are also pointing to increased threats against election workers, judges, and public officials, militia activity, political intimidation, and online radicalization. Most Americans reject violence. We see a lot of folks who do wear their common sense caps. We see and we know that violence is an extremist thing, and most Americans reject that. However, the normalization of rhetoric about enemies, traitors, taking the country back by force, these type of words. I don't want to say the other ones that we hear a lot, but these This type of rhetoric is very concerning, and it's caught the attention of researchers definitely. Third, information fragmentation and competing realities. A functioning democracy depends on broad agreement about basic facts and legitimacy. The U.S. increasingly has fragmented media ecosystems. We have different groups consuming entirely different narratives about elections, crime, immigration, economics, and even science. You name the topic, you can find a completely, totally different narrative. Channels, get your information from several different sources and talk to people and read and do research online, ask questions. Researchers, and call your government officials and talk to them. Researchers studying democratic backsliding often warn that when citizens no longer trust elections, courts, journalism, or constitutional processes, that it becomes more and more difficult to resolve political disputes peacefully. So, many experts are therefore describing the current national situation as severe polarization. We have a media ecosystem that increasingly rewards outrage over understanding. With social media algorithms that monetize division like it's a renewable energy source, we're not merely disagreeing, we are becoming mutually incomprehensible. And that, my friends, is very dangerous. Our republic depends on some shared reality, some shared moral grammar, some shared understanding of what we owe each other. And without that, everything just becomes about power and grabbing that power. Power alone is a terrible national religion. It's a terrible national religion because I still believe faith rocks. Not in a vague, inspirational quote kind of way. I mean actual confidence that Americans can still work together. We can. Because truth still matters. Institutions can be repaired. Common sense is not extinct. Liberty and virtue still belong together. And most, most importantly, disagreement does not have to become destruction. Long term success of this nation is still possible if we recover enough of our shared principles. Faith still rocks because cynicism builds nothing. At some point, somebody has got to believe that this country is still worth improving through cooperation. There's this thing, light still leads. Light does still lead. What does that mean? That mercy still matters. Morality still matters. Goodness still matters. Responsibility matters. Integrity matters. And justice matters. These are not outdated religious relics. These are the infrastructure of civilization. Without them, freedom becomes noise. It's just consumption, impulse, and chaos with better branding. Light still leads because societies drift when they stop distinguishing between what is wise and what is merely popular. And many of America's founding principles are still worth preserving. Constitutional limits, checks and balances, religious liberty, freedom of speech, due process, equal protection under the law. People are capable of greatness and corruption. That is constitutional wisdom because the Constitution tells us power must be restrained. That's how it's designed and engineered. That's also biblical realism, the restraint of human power. We're a nation founded by imperfect people with unusually strong ideas. We're a divided country trying to remember what made freedom sustainable. Belief that truth, virtue, liberty, faith, and reason can still coexist. Not extreme, just truth, sort of. So tell me what you think. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. I'll see you next time. Thanks so much.